Okay, so the 5090 review, that was last week. That's old news. That's a down payment on a car. That's 1 month's rent. But I say this, when you pay your rent, you only get satisfaction for 1 month. But when you buy a 5090, it just keeps giving the excitement. Okay, I can't even say that with a straight face. Anyway, moving on, we're going on to the 5080 now. The 80 series cards have always kind of been like the true gamer card, the true pinnacle card, whereas the 90 series / Titan cards we talked about have always been almost like a product demo of like, what happens if we just kind of go balls to the wall with the specs? Spoiler alert, the 5080 is just really meh. Today's video is brought to you by the new, really super cool JSUSense Melty connector shirt, paying tribute to one of the best designs that's clearly ever existed. And if you don't like the Vaporwave colors, we've got our OG gray and red colors available now. So get yours by following the link in the description below.
Nice.
Ow, I have a thigh cramp. Okay, so things we're gonna cover in today's review: performance, power draw, temperature, generational performance, uplift, obviously gaming performance. Yeah, we're gonna be comparing it to everything you've seen on our charts already up till now, including 3090, 3080, 4080, 4080 Super, 7900 XTX. Actually, that's gonna be pretty relevant in this review roundup versus the 5090, because 5090 was just so far out ahead of anything else. Nothing even comes close to it. So it was really just all by itself out there. Some of the key specs to worry about here: it's got 10,752 CUDA cores in the 5080 versus 9,728 CUDA cores in the 4080. I want to kind of preface something here real quick. It was a bit of a challenge, or a bit unique in this instance, to determine which graphics card to compare it to, because the launch price of the 5080 launch price is $999. That's actually $200 cheaper than the 4080 launched at, which was $1,199, or $200 US more expensive. But let's not forget, halfway through the cycle, NVIDIA launched the 4080 Super at $999, which was a couple of percent performance uplift at $200 less price. So in this review, it's kind of confusing because I'm comparing it to the 4080 because SKU for SKU, that's where it really matches up. But you're gonna see the 4080 and 4080 Super on these charts because price parity wise, it really should be paired up with the 4080 Super. But in terms of generational uplift and stuff, my percentages and everything is based off of the 4080 and not the Super, because when you see these charts, you can guarantee a 5080 Super is coming at some point. There's just way too much of a gap left there. In fact, it doesn't even reach the 4090 performance, which is like one of the first times we haven't seen an 80 series card meet or surpass either a previous Titan and or 90 series card. So it's really kind of disappointing in that aspect if we talk about just rasterization and raw horsepower uplift. Now, part of that can be because of the fact that it's technically on the same process as the 40 series cards. Depending on where you look for information, Phil and I were talking about this offline, it might be called 5 nanometer, it might be called 4 nanometer. It's technically TSMC 5 nanometer process, but NVIDIA is calling it their 4N process, 4 nanometer, kind of what they're called. So anyway, take the naming with a grain of salt. Really, it's like the same process as Ada Lovelace. So it's really, that's why the performance uplift is just so kind of really not that great. In fact, that's why the performance uplift is definitely scaling with power and core clock. So, and CUDA core count, because remember, there's more CUDA cores in 50 series than 40 series, which is why realistically, anyone that's just calling the 5090 a 4090 Ti and anyone calling the 5080 a 4080 Ti Super is very, very accurate. Anyway, moving on, 16 gigabytes of GDDR7, so it does have more memory bandwidth than it does on the 40 series. Remember, 40 series is GDDR6 or 6X, depending on the SKU. It's a 256-bit memory bus, and it's a PCIe Gen 5. As we've already shown, and all the other reviewers that have also shown PCIe Gen 5 versus Gen 4 versus Gen 3, there's really nothing. If the 5090 was not seeing huge drops, like for us, it was like 2 to 3% loss between Gen 5 and Gen 3. On a 5090, you can guarantee the 5080 is not going to be bottlenecked by your PCI Express bus. Anyway, moving on. Base clock is a 2295, boost clock 2617. I didn't bother doing a clock chart on this one. It goes all the way to its max clocks every time because the cooler is the same cooler that's found on the RTX 5090. Although it's a little bit more of that brass color. It's like that 40 series color brought back. So it's not gunmetal. It's definitely more of a bronzy, brassy color, I guess. It's essentially the exact same cooler with its 3D vapor chamber, with the heat pipes that are actually extensions of the vapor chamber where they're not soldered on to the vapor chamber like other coolers. It's the same split PCB design where it's got 3 separate components to the PCB. Same power connector, angled plug, everything about it dimensionally is the same. It just doesn't have liquid metal. Now something's different inside because the weight is actually different. So if we go ahead and weigh the 5090 once again, 1,852 grams, whereas the 5080, 1,646 grams. So 1,650. Okay, 1,650. So it is about 200 grams lighter, and Phil's joking around saying, is it 200 grams of liquid metal? I mean, I don't think it's that heavy, obviously, it's not that heavy. But anyway, slight differences. I kind of wish they had just kept it gunmetal like the rest, but this one is definitely more of that kind of a bronzy color. I think it's a pretty color. It's just if you're really aesthetically driven, and if you're paying $1,000 for a graphics card, you probably are gonna be aesthetically driven to some degree, function and form. Just know that this is gonna clash with some builds, so it's just worth kind of putting out there. It's a 360 watt TDP design. Now that's up from the 4080, which is a 320 watt design, so it's 40 watts more expensive, and it is recommended to have a 750 watt PSU. With no further ado, just like last time, we're gonna just run through the charts real quick. It's your job to pause and look at the charts you want. It is just the same story across the board, whether it's 1080p, 1440p, or 4K. It is just as much faster than a 4080 Super than the 4080 Super was versus the 4080. So the new hierarchy goes 4080, 4080 Super, 5080, then 4090, then 5090, but those are whole different tiers. And it's so bunched up down there, it's kind of crazy, which at 999 bucks, it's like, okay, you're getting a little bit of performance uplift when we talk about 4080 Super versus 5080. Anyway, let's talk about some of these performance uplifts real quick here. Remember, pause the chart on the one you want to look at and then come back and listen again. It's just too many charts to go through and talk about, here's what 6% uplift looks like, guys. You know, it's just whatever. The median uplift across our gaming test, and I didn't take into account Times by Extreme or Speedway for these uplifts. This is just the games themselves, the game engines, was 14.24% uplift. So if we break that down per title, and we're calling the RTX 3080 the 100% or baseline performance. If we talk about Cyberpunk, we went from a 3080 to a 4080 at 69.3% performance uplift. Let's also not forget that the 4080 was 86% more expensive than a 3080. So that's important to point out. Don't forget, 30 series was running on Samsung's 8 nanometer process, where 40 series went back on TSMC's 4 nanometer / 5 nanometer, depending on which name you look at, process. So it's actually less performance uplift than the cost was when you think about that. So that's not a great proposition. I guess the fact that we're seeing any performance uplift at less money going from 4080 to 5080 is an okay story, but it's just not the generational uplift we're used to, which is usually like 25%. So we gained 25% uplift 5080 versus 4080 in Cyberpunk. In Avatar, we gained 10.5%. In F1, we gained 8.1%, Black Myth, 17.3%, and these are all in 4K, by the way. Stalker 2, 12.5%, Borderlands 3, 18.2%, Horizon Forbidden West, 8.1%. To put that into perspective, the lowest performance uplift we saw going from a 3080 to a 4080 was actually Borderlands 3 at 46.2%, and the highest uplift we saw was Black Myth at 89.2%. But again, that's not a great story because just about all of those, except for Black Myth, is underneath the 86% price uplift we saw from 30 to 40. But if we talk about the prices though, 4080 was $1,200, 5080 is $999. So the performance jump actually moves to about 11% versus the 14.24% when you compare it to the 4080 Super versus the 4080. Again, it's something. Like, this is NVIDIA really heavily leaning into the software game. The fact that it's practically the same process, the fact that they are really leaning into the multi-frame gen stuff and the whole AI interpolated frames, that's the future. And we talked about that. A lot of people are unhappy about that. This is definitely the cusp of that, what that new horizon looks like to NVIDIA. So this is definitely a skip it card. If you're on a 40 series, 80 series card, if you're on a 4070 or something like that, you'll see a pretty huge jump going to something like this. If you're on 30 series anything, that's a huge jump. Even 3090, it just absolutely destroys the 3090. And don't forget the 3090 was, what, $1,500? Yeah, and then up to $2,000, you've got a 3090 Ti. It's not included in our charts. I still have to benchmark ours, but it would absolutely curb stomp all over that too. Let's talk about the temps though. So the 4080 at stock fan curve in Furmark 4K with our 10-minute run capped out at 62C. You can see that on the chart right here. And the 5080 stock fan curve capped out at 71. So that shows you right there just how good the cooler is, considering the fact that it was designed for a much hotter, much higher TDP card at 575 watts. That also says a lot about the liquid metal and the thermal design, considering the 5090 in the same test capped out at 77. So we only went from 77 to 71 by dropping down to thermal paste rather than liquid metal. And whatever is different in there, there might be some, I don't know if it looks like the same amount of heat pipes and everything to me, but there's clearly something different because it's 200 grams lighter. So keep that in mind. But if we talk about real gaming performance, not something like Furmark, which is really designed to stress and push the card as hard as it can. In fact, Furmark to me looks like, it's like that meme from the cheerleader, the guy that's holding up the big cheerleader and he's like super tiny. It's also the meme that you see in the car world when you talk about putting high boost on stock internals. It's the same thing kind of applying here with Furmark. It's just pushing the crap out of the limits of the card. But once we go into gaming, it actually drops down quite a bit. The 4080's 62C in Cyberpunk 4K, no frame gen, no DLSS, just raw rasterization in 4K, and 67C for the 5080 with the stock fan curve. Stock fan curve. I didn't speed up the fan curve. I didn't even mess with the MSI fan curve because the nice thing is at that fan curve, it is practically silent, but you are under 70C in our open air test bench with the temperature locked at 72C in here like it's supposed, not 72C. Wow, that would be very hot. 72 degrees Fahrenheit or 22C in this room. So no weirdness like I was dealing with our PCI Express where I had the room too cold. Lesson learned on that. Power draw, measured by our PMD2 device at the power plug itself because software will only show 360 watts no matter what, because that's what the card is told. The card is told, hey, if you're under load and you're power limited, just tell whatever software is asking you're running 360 watts. But that's why we measure with the PMD2 because it tells the true story. It's actually measuring the current going through the cable. And it was actually pulling in 4K, Furmark says 360 software, it was pulling almost 390 watts from the cable. That is nearly 30 watts higher or almost 30% more than what its actual TDP is. So that's why we measure with the PMD2. It's interesting though, we'll see what the overclocking headroom is like on that card soon because remember our spec is 600 plus watts on the 2x6. So you might have more overclocking headroom in the 3080, or excuse me, the 5080 than we were seeing with the 5090 because 5090 is already at that limit, just at stock speeds. But once you put it in a real, and you can see on the chart right here, once you put it under a real load, it actually drops down to about 335 to 340 watt in Cyberpunk, which is actually under the rated 360. And it's funny because as long as it's under the 360, the software and the PMD match. As soon as it goes above that, that's where the disparity happens. And no longer does it match the PMD because, well, if it's only supposed to be pulling 360 and it's reporting that's pulling higher than that, then that looks bad. But actual power draw is higher than that. But the 4080 also pulls a lot less than the 5080 because of the fact that it is a lower TDP card at 320 versus 360. It was pulling under 300 watts in Cyberpunk. And as you saw in Furmark, it wasn't pulling, it was barely pulling its 320. It was like 322 in Furmark. Let's talk about the value proposition of this card. If you can get your hands on it, and you were already considering a 4080, and you can get it for its MSRP or anywhere near its MSRP, it is a no-brainer to buy it if you were in the market for a 4080. Because, like I said, it's the same price bracket at 14% more performance. It's not great on the uplift. It's not as much as we're used to, but it's something. Now, the one thing we didn't talk about here is actual multi-frame gen. I did do my Cyberpunk 4K multi-frame gen. The thing is, when we did the multi-frame gen test with the 5090, Phil and I both were like, it's not terrible. But remember, the input latency is based upon the actual true rendered frame. Not the AI interpolated frame the graphics card is doing, the actual frame the game is rendering, which also takes into account your inputs, your keyboard and your mouse. So the higher the base frame rate can be, which the 5090 in 4K Cyberpunk, which is where I tested this, was 60 FPS. We were still getting the input latency of 60 FPS, which is doable. It's not the greatest experience. It does have a little bit of a jello-y feel to it, but enough to where you can kind of like ignore it if you want the higher frame rate and you want to leave the settings on high and all that, so you need the higher frame rate to make up for the fact that you're taking a settings hit. You can get by in single player games that just are not that important when it comes to Twitch response. The 5080, however, has a significantly lower base frame rate. And because of that, even though we were getting well into the hundreds of FPS, well into like over 150 FPS, I believe it was. The chart's right here. I can't remember the number off the top of my head. It is gross the farther into multi-frame gen you go. Frame gen on like 1 or technically 2x, 1 extra frame. 2x is 1 extra frame technically. It's doable. It's not great. It's pretty bad, but it's doable. But the farther you get that frame rate away from the base frame rate, which in this instance is like 38 FPS, it is disgusting. Phil said he felt like it was like playing with those, you know, you go to the bowling alley or whatever. I know I'm dating myself right now. Okay, you go to the grocery store or whatever, you put the quarter in, you put the little knob, you get the little toy, and you get like those little like, those sticky hands. You get like, hey, that's my piece of paper, and pull it off someone's desk. He said he felt like he was playing with that. Like it was that jello-y with the keyboard and mouse. And I agree, it was disgusting. From across the room, I'd say, Phil, look at this. And I'd wiggle the mouse and you would get like it was not in sync. It was terrible. So frame gen should not be a selling point on anything under a 5090 as far as I'm concerned. Let's put this into perspective. Obviously all of those memes about, oh, 4090 owners now, how they feel about the 5070. If I'm saying it's that bad on a 5080, and the base frame rate on a 5070 is gonna be that much worse, yeah, Jensen and his Lizard jacket, his Lizard King jacket might be up there saying, yeah, look, the FPS is like at the 4090 level. Of course, he didn't talk about the actual experience because we know Jensen's not a gamer. So that's not something he would have ever considered. He would just look at that one metric and say, look, how amazing the software is. If he actually ever used a keyboard and mouse, and in that scenario, I don't think he would have been so proud of it, to be honest. They've got other things on their mind though, considering at the time of filming this, NVIDIA's stock dropped 17% in one day because of the AI stuff taking place. So there is that. But it's just not, if I'm trying, look, I'm all about positivity, where positivity is due. It's 14% more performance than the 4080 was, which was more expensive, but realistically just above 11% more performance at the same price of the 4080 Super. It's something. I don't, unless you're gonna start utilizing, because you can't talk about the huge frame buffer, it's 16 gigs, which a lot of people were upset about. A lot of people felt like the 4080, or excuse me, the 5080 should have had at least 24 gigs, right? It's got the new NVEC encoder stuff going on. It's got 3 of those. So if you're gonna be live streaming and whatnot, you would get better, smoother FPS, assumably with your frame with less, or with your stream with less frame drops and stuff. It's not gonna hit your game performance as hard. It's not gonna hit your CPU at all. So there's that to talk about. But just, this is a software generation. And us gamers that are all about raw performance, it's just not exciting. So 40 series users, if you're running an 80 series card, zero reason to upgrade whatsoever, unless you're looking at paying double for a 5090. But it does make a lot of sense for anyone running a 30 series. It really does. It is a huge uplift in performance versus 30 series. But again, it's all about what you can get it for. With scalping and day one availability being such a cluster, usually with these launches, I have a feeling a lot of 30 series owners are also gonna just be hanging on to their card as long as possible. So that's it. I don't know what else to talk about here. I guess I'm just a little sad. I was hoping for more, I really was. I'm truly an enthusiast for the hardware. I love to just plug something in and go, look at all the power. This one was just like, cool.